Hi everyone, welcome to the talk. My name's Andrew Page, I'm from Harness. Today we're here to talk to you about empowering developers and to drive business innovation with software delivery. So I'm just going to do a bit of a brief introduction from my perspective, then hand over to Sam from Metrikus, who's one of our customers. Just a bit of a brief introduction for me. I've worked in the software industry for around 18 years now. I started my life in application support, so supporting critical applications. And then I moved into more professional services and consulting and very kind of customer facing. Spent some time in the financial services sector, primarily on investment banking technology. And the more relevant part of my career, the last kind of 5 to 10 years, has been in application performance monitoring, which some of you may have come across various companies. And more relevant is the kind of DevOps space, so CI and CD. So I'm going to set the scene initially in terms of how the landscape of software is changing. So I think you'll probably all agree that every company today is becoming a software company. Whether you speak to someone on the phone, whether you're using an app, software is very much integral to our existence. And I think you'll probably agree as well, the way we're delivering software today is changing. So it's really moving away from kind of manual deployment approaches. I'm sure a lot of you have adopted, CI/CD. You've moved to public cloud. So we're really going through a new era of kind of automation where it's really critical around your choice in terms of the DevOps tool set. So I think a common theme that we're seeing, speaking to a number of different customers across different verticals, is the innovation. So really companies have to move at speed today. And if you move into the cloud and you're moving away from the kind of monolithic application approach, I'm sure a lot of you are taking applications, you're breaking them down into microservices, so decoupling critical business functions, so you have the ability to move faster. You can update components individually, there's less dependencies, which really allow you to drive more business features and innovation quicker, and really gives you a more kind of flexible approach. So whether it's Kubernetes, ECS, PCF, all these different containerized platforms, that's really where we're seeing the move in the market today. So with this move to more velocity, you can often update things more and more frequently. So generally smaller updates. So there's ideally less risk, but this does introduce more complexity into the delivery lifecycle. But ultimately, you can get bugs fixes out to clients quicker if you really embrace this whole agile process. So this is the kind of what we call the value driver we're going to be focusing on today. Around delivery, but also specifically around how Metrikus are using feature flags today. So just a bit about the role of DevOps and how we see that changing. So it's really around automating everything today. So typically when we speak to customers, there's a semi-automated CI and CD process. You're probably using a lot of scripts to glue things together. But really, if you want to achieve this velocity and sustain it, you're going to have to automate everything. That's the kind of the real first point. But you're also going to need to do this very quickly and reliably. So the more and more often you deploy, the next bottleneck is essentially going to become your verification process. So you deploy your code to production, great, but how do you verify that customers are having a good experience, a reliable service? So this does really interleave into what we're going to talk about around how to effectively use things like feature flagging. Another kind of common theme we're seeing is around self-service. So typically, DevOps tools are managed by a central team. It tends to hinder the developers in terms of getting code out there. So building their own pipelines, doing a lot of scripting. So the theme here is also, let's enable the developers to do a lot of the work themselves. Provide them with templated pipelines and really enable this self-service experience. And also security and governance. So some of you may work in regulated industries, so things like audit, role-based access control are critical. So it's really key that these features they're built into the platform, but they're also exposed to the end developer. So that's just a very brief intro from me. I'll wrap up the session just talking a bit about Harness, who we are, why we're different, and just running through a few of the key features. But I'd like to hand over to Sam now to give you the bulk of the talk.
Hi, everyone. I'm Sam Hall, Head of Technology at Metrikus. I kind of started my life at a lighting company where we were almost at the opposite end of this cycle. So we weren't building software applications so much. It was more, how do we get different hardware into a system as quickly and easy as possible? and that culminated in launching the Hive Active Light. We then needed to produce an application on the front of that that was like a mobile application, which is my first introduction to feature flags, which is where I sort of came across it. And then moved into Metrikus a couple of years ago, which is an application for the property technology industry, which I'll briefly introduce you to so that you can sort of understand the context of why this reduction of release risk and why we started at sort of almost like the opposite end that many people do. So who are we at Metrikus? We are a property technology business where we're looking to revolutionize the smart building industry, where we're trying to basically pull in lots and lots of different hardware, lots and lots of different systems, so you can get a single view of your data ecosystem, really. So we pull in data from indoor air quality sensors, we pull them in from all sorts of different places, so that you can then, as quickly as possible, get insights about your building. We want to, as I said, connect all of your different sensors, systems and sensors into one place, so that you can, and a bit of a buzz phrase here, but reduce data silos and produce a unified view of systems. We then want to use that data to quickly inform people about what that data is while reducing analyst time. I think that's kind of the critical thing that we want to do. We do allow you to produce custom dashboards, but it's about trying to make it easier for people at the end of the day. And then we want to enable people to automate actions to reduce the operational and overhead costs to make better data-driven decisions about their buildings. We also produce an API so that if you want to do your own thing, you can feel free and build your own application. We know full well that this is a huge, huge industry that many different people want to do many different things, and we're not going to be able to produce it for everyone. So we give you the platform to build what you would like. Some of the different things that we connect are BMSs, energy monitoring, space utilization, smart cleaning, et cetera, et cetera. One of the challenges from sort of a DevOps perspective is all of these systems have their own processes. They all have their own APIs. They all have their own release schedules that we have to interweave ourselves into and make sure that whenever they do a release, that we, of course, are synchronized with that. If something changes about their API, because I'm sure many of you know, people don't all the time, necessarily synchronize with you when they're making a change on their platform. So we have to make sure that we have the systems on the back end to check whether something is going wrong. We need to be able to release things quickly if something does go wrong, because our job as Metrikus is to be able to take data in and then give it back to you in the format that you want. So if we're no longer taking it in because there's been an API change, then that causes a problem, right? So as a sort of an overall thing, what we aim to do is we want to set you up in minutes. We want to give you 5 minutes to set up, 10 minutes to get to insights, and then 15 minutes to be able to share it with your team, because I think often it's a real challenge to make sure that from a smart buildings perspective, people often think it's like a massive long thing. I think it's a similar thing you see in DevOps is it's this huge task that you need to get done. So we want people to be able to get it to your boss, to people as fast as possible. We want people to also be able to tailor their reports or just go to the API if they want. But that's really like, as I say, it's more like the secondary thing. And then quickly and consistently demonstrate ROI. We're now moving more into how do you use AI and machine learning to reduce, the need for human intervention even more. I think that's the next advent of technology, really for everyone. But we're looking at it to how do we make it easier for people to manage buildings. So we all kind of want 0% change failure, as I touched on before. It would be ideal if every single update that we ever did was perfect, that nothing ever failed, but that's clearly not possible. There's all sorts of things that are out of your control. For us, it's primarily like sensor providers, people we're pushing data to, you know, for our worst case scenario, how do we prevent loss of key business data? What's our critical path for data, and how do you make sure that that critical path is sort of, you know, sacrosanct? What we're trying to do is, as much as possible, just reduce that risk for our clients, because that's really what we're paid for, as I think I hopefully showed you. The old world, I think, is you sort of have a rocket launch, you know, where I think everyone starts. You have some subject matter expert who understands everything about the platform. They know that you've got this service, that service. You know, I need to update that one first. I need to update that one next. And you just launch it as often as possible. I know that certainly when I went into Metrikus, there wasn't necessarily a release schedule. It would just be when the feature is done, whatever that meant, then you would release it as quickly as you possibly could. But there wasn't like a continuous deployment platform. It was simply how could we log onto a server and update the application. Once you've then done that launch, how do you actually verify successful launches? I think quite often, you know, you'll have setups where you might have something like Datadog or something similar that is checking whether you have failures. But I think we all know that failure, sometimes it can take a while for it to sort of crop up. How do you actually make sure that your system is working as you expected it to? How do you roll back if there is a failure? How do you deal with stateful services? A critical problem for us is most of the time with a new feature, there will be some kind of schema update on a database. You know, we have a set of SQL servers that, of course, if you are moving from the old version of the application and upgrading, that's easy. You know, upgrading is always easy. So what happens, though, if you're now wrong? What happens if you need to downgrade? You know, we've had a scenario about 1.5 years ago where we have to match basically our internal IDs of sensors. We have an external ID. So you say, okay, this is our internal ID and this is external ID. What we hadn't anticipated was that people might, instead of having an external ID where they have it as unique in their system, they might just increment by 1. So you have, you know, ID 1, ID 2, ID 3, and then per building, they just start from 1 again. So that means that now, all of a sudden, you've got 4 different devices, all that are called external ID 1, because we simply didn't anticipate that they would not, in their cloud system, use that as something that was unique. So we had to migrate everything over. When we did that upgrade, then we had some issues again with how making sure those external IDs were unique, and rolling back would have been very, very difficult. So how do you make sure that you have successful launches as well as regular launches? And I think what we kind of dream about is this utopia where you've got commit to production times of, I can't remember what the sort of elite number is these days. Can you help me? What was it's meant to be like hours from commit to production is the sort of the best case scenario, which, you know, when you're going from the old world where you're thinking, geez, it can take me a month to go from code to production, let alone 3 hours. It seems like a long way away. So you're looking at, you know, these systems where you've got a build step that finds your failures immediately, where you've got tests that are running in 10 minutes versus what you know that you've got right now is 2 hours. You're like, how am I going to get from here to here? You know, you've got a deployment system that's integrating with customer demands where, you know, you might have a multi-tenanted system that you know you control easily. But I know I have problems as well where we also have some systems that are on-premises or private cloud. So how do you now synchronize the system that you control with the other systems so that you're now not in a scenario where you've got, you know, this diverse set of versions that you've released, and all of a sudden you're seeing bugs again where, okay, it turns out that customer just happened to be on an old version. But how do you get to that stage? How do you do that verification step that I mentioned? How do you make sure that when you do upgrade everyone, that in fact, yeah, you've not missed some scenario or something in that particular set of circumstances has gone wrong, especially when you have that diversity of potential installations. And then finally, how do you actually control feature releases? How do you make sure that product maintain control and marketing maintain control? Because I think a lot of the reasons that you start with rocket launches is not because you, as a developer community, maybe can't launch. It's because you get told by marketing or get told by product, oh, we can't release this new version of a feature because we have to train people on this, or we have to produce some set of marketing or send out a tweet or whatever it is they want to do. But it's no longer just how do we release stuff quickly, it's how do we synchronize it with other departments, but you want to get code to production so that then you can move things over as fast as possible. And then finally, with all these new features, how do you actually make sure that this is all at an appropriate cost? Because at the end of the day, if you release a feature and it costs you a fortune, then eventually the business will run out of money. So how do you make sure you have that governance and everything set up appropriately? So, yeah, how do you actually move from rocket launches to rapid commit to production times? Where we sort of started was pretty much at the opposite end, I think, to what many people do. A lot of people will start at, they'll do CI, CD. So logically, you start with the build step, and then you do the deploy step, and and you go from left to right. We actually decided to go from right to left. And the reason we did that was because it allowed us to focus primarily on the customer as quickly as possible. And I'll show you an example in a bit of how it changed the way that we built some features. But we started with feature flags so that we could control how you actually, basically, once a feature was delivered, you didn't have to migrate everyone over instantly. You could release something that was technically probably unfinished, but you could test it with your beta testers, with your alpha testers, with your internal community, as quickly as you possibly could, so you could get feedback on it. And rather than trying to speed up code, because I think that's often the thing that I know my team was nervous about, was writing the code doesn't get quicker. The code takes exactly the same long amount of time, regardless of how good your CI/CD system is. You can't write code better because you've got a better testing system. You still have to write good code. So instead, it was how do we get potentially earlier code into production to test with people that can give us feedback? How can we learn from people as fast as possible? And the way that we did that was, working with feature flags, so we could identify that X customer wants to look at this feature. Okay, well, we've produced it in a month. It's not quite finished yet, but try it out, tell us what you think, and then we can bring that into this development cycle as early as possible and bring your feedback in before we have before we have the bugs, basically. So what were our kind of considerations, I suppose, when we were looking at different systems? Future-proofing was probably the main thing. We had, there's lots and lots of different ways of doing feature flags. I think the classic one from my DevOps colleague was basically, why don't we just use a Boolean and read us? Which was like, well, look, if you want to build it yourself, you can feel free. I'm sure, I hope you have better work to do than set up a feature flag system. But really, it was how do we target people? How do we actually make sure that we're giving it to the right set of clients? And then secondarily, how do we then integrate that longer term with this utopian vision of a CI/CD platform where you can release stuff as quickly as possible? We didn't want to just implement something that would work for the use case for now, but not work for the use case that we were seeing as the longer term vision of this sort of right to left proposal that I was saying. We start with the customer, and then we work back to how do we actually get better testing, better deployments, et cetera, et cetera. So we wanted a system that would not just allow us to do feature flags, but also how do we now integrate it with a process where we've actually done deployments again to lots and lots of different potential multi-tenanted systems, single-tenanted systems. How do we make sure that the feature flagging system knows or understands how all that fits together? You know, it can't just be an isolated thing that marketing use or whatever. We also wanted to make sure that it kind of solved the key goal of moving launches away from DevOps and away from developers, because for us as well, anyway, the main consideration for releasing was how do we integrate with product marketing? How do we integrate with the product team? How do we make sure that ops is trained appropriately? So it needed to be easy enough to use so that it wasn't something that our DevOps team was actually training people on and helping them to, I guess, get onboarded. It needed to be simple. And so what were the kind of results? So this was actually pretty much the first feature that we utilized feature flags with, which was we have like, as I mentioned, we have indoor air quality sensors that we bring in data from, and we have like a wellness panel to give people analytics about it. Normally, producing a new panel for us takes around 3 months, give or take the change, where a lot of that is actually bug fixing, testing. As I mentioned, how do you actually go from when you got lots of different graphs, there's lots and lots of different edge cases that we needed to test. What we were able to do is the one that you can see on the top left was the very first version. It was kind of unfinished. You had pretty much the home tab. You didn't have some of the extended data views and things like that. But we managed to get that to production within a month. So we cut our kind of commit to production time by 66%. But really the critical thing for us was we were able to test these features with customers straight away. So we had tons of feedback about how these different features didn't quite do what people wanted. Sorry, do you have a question?
What did it include? Is it back-end, front-end, data, all of it?
Yeah, so this one was quite good as a first pass because this was just a new front end. So it was much, much simpler. We went for the simple case rather than having to do any of those complex migrations and changes, because that would have involved, it'd be much more difficult. So this was primarily a new presentation of data, which made it ideal for that feature flag testing case, because now we could test the presentation, test how people received it, and make any changes as we were building things. We've had a couple of cases recently where we have basically used it in coordination with some data changes. That's much, much more difficult. Where we've mainly used, we've actually migrated basically the API, so had like a V2 or V beta or whatever you want to call it, API version that you then have within your code. The feature flag that's the new version is looking at the new version of the API, but that is a lot more difficult to manage. But yeah, we could get the features out to customers as quickly as we could. We got some really great feedback where basically some obvious things, like to us, we just quite liked the look of those dials on the top left, thought it looked cool. No one really understood what they meant. It was like, actually, I'm not getting anything useful from them. So we changed them to these more simple dials. We wanted to put way more about lots of different things on the page. Turned out people wanted more about one thing. So we just slightly changed the way that things worked, made it more obvious which tab you were on. As it happened, it ended up taking approximately 3 months to get everything finished. But that feature was basically at the stage where normally we'd be there in about 6 months. So the code took exactly the same amount of time. It's just it was at the point where we were happy with it as a feature way, way, way earlier. And we caught those mistakes on the presentation much, much faster. And where we are now is that release is now completely controlled by product. Certainly for front-end features, we can release them as fast as we want, in terms of actually getting them to production. We can get things tested by ops in, as basically very, very, very early, because especially for onboarding different sensors, then whenever we change anything, that is a long process to make sure it's better than the old system. And we want to migrate people slowly. And feature flags has really been the key for us to do that. So now I think I'm passing back to Mr. Page for a little bit about Harness.
Cool. Thank you, Sam. Very, very interesting, very enlightening. So I thought we'd just wrap up with just a bit of an introduction to who we are. So why Harness? So essentially we are a software vendor. We're sponsoring the event. We've been in the market around 4 to 5 years now. In EMEA specifically around 3 years. And there's just a kind of few points here I wanted to run through and just show you a few kind of screenshots of why we're doing things differently in software delivery. So that encompasses, disciplines like CI/CD, feature flagging, cloud cost management, and we'll be releasing something called Change Intelligence this year as well, which is very much an AI ops capability. But I think what's different about us versus other providers is our use of artificial intelligence and machine learning in the relevant modules. So there's some screenshots we can show you here. If you want to get a more in-depth view, a demonstration of the software, please pop down to the stand. We're just at the bottom of the stairs. But the other key theme is really around this self-service and improving the developer experience. So I think through the user interface, or through YAML, or through config as code, we're really trying to cover all the different types of developers and all the different types of users that exist out there in the world. And reducing scripting. So we really started our journey doing continuous delivery as a service, and the biggest problem we saw in the market there, whether it was a tool like Jenkins or any other open source CI platform, is to do CD, you really had to script a lot. So you had to script around binaries, APIs, to really do continuous delivery efficiently. But that then becomes a bit of a bottleneck when you scale those platforms or if you're maintaining them. So that's a very common pain point we see from customers, and our CD capability aims to remove that scripting element, especially for platforms that are containerized like Kubernetes. Let the tool do all that heavy lifting. Why build it and script it yourself and maintain it, and let the software platform do the hard work. And we'll get onto a bit around how we scale, templating pipelines as well. Now, why should a developer write a pipeline from scratch? Let's provide that from a central team, provide a parameterized pipeline that delivers in a certain pattern, and then federate all that control out to the actual developers. Very similar to the way that Metrikus are using feature flagging. You want to give the guys that control the product and interface directly with the customer the control over the features, rather than raising a ticket in the system to get a developer or a DevOps engineer to tweak a flag. And that's exactly the same process that Harness went through in terms of releasing features to our clients. We had to log a ticket as a kind of front-end customer-facing person. Someone else had to kind of action that, until we actually built our own feature flagging system internally, so people in the customer-facing teams could turn things on or off for our customers. But we've actually migrated away from that. We've built a product that we're offering to clients, but we're also using that internally ourselves. And the last point is around security and governance. So we've touched a bit on security points earlier around good role-based access control across different environments. If you have to segregate duties between your developers and your ops people, you need very fine-grained RBAC, so role-based access control to do that, but also the governance of the pipeline. So the more and more power you give to developers to deploy also comes with a lot of risk. So how do you give developers freedom, but also put governance checks in place? Are they pulling an image from a trusted repo, for example? How do you enable that kind of experience? So there's a few points we have which cover that. If you haven't seen Harness before, this is what the user interface looks like. This is what we're calling the next generation. So you may have seen Harness a year or so ago. It was very continuous delivery focused, but now we're really covering the entire software delivery stack. So if you see on the left-hand side there, you see the different kind of modules, which are all natively integrated. We're one true native platform. You can take us as SaaS or take us self-hosted on-premise. And we really aim to bring together everything into one individual pipeline. So you can build using a graphical UI, or you can toggle to YAML. So underneath that graphical representation is just one linear YAML file. So there's a YAML edit experience here. You can click on edit. You've got syntax checking, autocomplete, or you could just do it straight from Git. So we use Git as like the single source of truth, and we can also drive things like branching, through the Harness platform, which translates into the Git world as well. So those are the two kind of major experiences that we're focusing on now in next gen. And this is something called test intelligence. So we're in the world of CI now. So how do you make your CI more efficient is really the goal here. So we focus primarily on unit testing here. So how do you make that unit testing cycle more efficient? And this is where we're using machine learning to really choose the relevant tests that should be run. So say you have an application that you run 10,000 unit tests on every time. If you change a very small part of that app, why should you run the same unit test again and again? It's essentially very, very inefficient. So what we're doing here is we're taking the code changes that are being made in Git and essentially correlating that with the application code. So using a technique called bytecode instrumentation, we correlate which part of the code is changed to which of the relevant methods and dependent methods in the code, and essentially select only the relevant tests that should be run. So that's the kind of principle. If you want to see it in action, feel free to pop down into the stand. And the other side of this is, well, if we have tests that fail very, very often, why don't we run those first? There's something called flaky tests. So again, the machine learning will help you with these two scenarios and really reduce your testing cycles. So again, today it's focused on unit testing, but we're going to be pushing out more into maybe performance testing or functional testing in the future. And here's some interesting results, actually. So I think we actually use this internally inside Harness, but I think the engineers took it and ran it across a number of different open source projects here. And so I think the figures kind of speak for themselves in terms of the efficiencies that you can gain. Okay, so Harness is very much a unified platform. So we talk about CI and CD, but this also extends to feature flagging. So we'll talk a bit more about it in a second, but we've also released feature flag pipelines as well. So again, you can drive everything through one unified experience. The developers only need to know one tool. And off the back of this, when you talk about continuous deployment, we've touched on verification a couple of times in the talk, but once you deploy something to your target state, how do you verify that the deployment's been successful? So when we came to the market initially, there's something called continuous verification. I think we very much kind of coined that phrase, which is really you deploy your artifacts to the target platform, and then you essentially bring in data from various tool sets. So these, Sam mentioned Datadog, which they probably use at Metrikus, but we bring in all these different signals. So time series data from the application performance tools. It could be log data from your log provider, Splunk, Elk, and then let machine learning do the hard work. So I'm not sure how many people here have to babysit deployments when they happen to see if things go wrong, but as you deploy faster and faster, this tends to become the next bottleneck. So the idea really is that we have ML processes that analyze all this data and essentially look for anomalies in the patterns. And when we detect anomalies, we can do things like auto rollback. So again, to the kind of utopia point, that's where everyone would like to be. But again, it's not perfect, but it helps you reduce that bottleneck of actually verifying your deployments. And pipeline governance. So again, I've touched on a few of these points around having good role-based access control to secure your pipelines. Again, for troubleshooting, Audit Trail is very useful if you're regulated or have auditors and you need to prove what happened leading up to a deployment. Audit Trail tends to be very, very important. So we have customers that save weeks worth of effort just by looking at audit trails of changes. And again, this extends into the feature flag world as well. Who turned on a feature to which particular customers? Having all that data audited can really help you pass compliance in hours rather than weeks and months. And just one very unique feature I think we've got that's coming up is an integration with OPA. So I'm not sure, has anyone come across Open Policy Agent here? Anyone heard that? Yep, awesome, we've got a hand. So again, I think this is very quickly becoming the kind of standard for kind of centralized governance, not just across deployment systems, but any system you need to run some kind of check over the syntax of a deployment, for example, using a language called Rego, I believe. So we'll be releasing essentially an OPA engine, I think, embedded inside the Harness product. So when you give developers the freedom to deploy to the platform and run any kind of checks that they want to, you can essentially enforce rules centrally inside an OPA engine. When the pipeline executes, Harness will call out to OPA. You will define your own checks. And I think there's an example here at the bottom where we're checking that an image comes from a trusted registry. So the developers can write what they want, but if they don't pass these certain centralized checks, then the pipeline will essentially be stopped, and some kind of notification will be sent through a tool like Slack or Microsoft Teams. So very, very exciting new addition, and I think that's coming out in Q4 in the platform. And I think Sam's covered a lot of this. Again, feature flags, again, part of the native platform, integrated with one particular pipeline, but also the developer-first experience. So everything in the product is underpinned by YAML. So rather than using the UI, you could just build out your feature flag pipeline in YAML, define which targets, as we say, will receive the particular feature based on a certain attribute. So again, just bringing everything together into one unified platform. Okay, so I think we finished a bit early. So this is a bit of a summary here. Are there any questions at all from the group? Yes.
About feature flags, how do you manage feature flags over time? Because your code base is going to be littered with feature flags. Do you decide at some point that this feature is hardened and it's no longer behind the feature flag? How do you propose to do that?
Yeah, I mean, Sam, I don't know if we want to talk from the customer perspective on that one. Yeah,
I think some of it is choice. You've got different kinds of flags, like operational flags, or sums where, eventually you want to remove them. You have to be honest, that is your own internal process, from our perspective anyway. I know that, for example, with the feature that I mentioned then, we removed that flag after about 4 to 5 months, so that, because it was complete. But you do have to then have, the discipline, essentially, to actually make sure you remove it yourself. I think something that you maybe could do is start to integrate that then further back in the process. It's not something we've done yet, but make sure that you are identifying, say, stale flags, ones that maybe you've not touched that flag in months. So you probably should get rid of it.
Does Harness give any indication of this flag been turned on for 3 months, 6 months?
Yeah, I think one of the things that springs to mind is when you're in the UI, for example, we're showing you how many times a flag's been evaluated. So you get a good view of the activity, who's turned the flag on or off through an audit trail. And when you define a flag, you can say, is this flag permanent or does it have a particular lifetime? And then we've got kind of reporting layers that you can run on top, so kind of BI analytics on that data. So you can hopefully run a report to understand how long the flag's been in existence, what kind of activity has happened, and which customers are using it, for example. Yeah.
The custom dashboard stuff is really quite useful. It's quite, as my colleague would put it, it's quite cute. It's nice.
Additional question on this: how do you ensure the stability of your product with the lot of variants you have in the feature flags activation, and how the quality mismatch which you could have in enabling 3 features and disabling the 3 other features? How do you deal with this?
Yes. So if you think back to when I was talking about verifying deployments, we're bringing in verification to the feature flag pipeline element as well. So again, if you deliver one feature to customer A and not to customer B, you need some kind of monitoring tool, some kind of signal around their user experience, for example. Things like response time errors. If it's a single tenant platform, maybe that's a lot easier than the multi-tenant. But if you can provide us data around the experience of some kind of metric like response time, then again you can feed that into the the verification platform. So we'll do things like anomaly detection on that. So if the response time is 10 times greater than normal, again, you could drive things like an untoggle of the feature for that particular client. But again, it's a common kind of capability we have, which will extend into feature flags, I think later this year or early next year.
One thing you can do that's quite nice as well, that I think your question was sort of leaning into, was what happens if you have dependencies between features as well? Like what happens if feature A depends on feature B and you try and turn on feature B? You can also actually state basically, like this feature cannot be turned on without this one or vice versa, which is nice.
Yeah, so prerequisites between
Yeah.
feature flags, yeah.
So you don't, you don't make that mistake and screw something up somehow.
Harness has a pretty good habit of reusing existing technologies rather than reinventing them. So the feature toggle service, is it based on Unleash? And if so, can you use existing Unleash clients?
I mean, feature flags it's all native. We've built everything. We've built a number of SDKs, so we're up to 10 now for different languages, across front, back end technologies. Those have also been open sourced as well. So that we may have some open source technologies or libraries within it, but ultimately it's not based on one kind of core existing feature flag technology right now.
One thing I didn't put in my bit, but it was very easy for us to actually integrate with Harness, because often one of the reasons we're actually doing this new platform is the old one is a little bit difficult to install stuff to, because it's a lovely pile of jQuery, so state is sort of a mystery sometimes. But it took us, I think it was 6 commits, I think is the stat that we used before, to actually integrate feature flags from Harness. So it was one of the easiest things we've had to integrate, certainly on the front end. Back end is obviously harder, but the front end was really quite simple from a customer perspective.
You said you used machine learning to select some of the unit tests that are being run on the pipeline, but isn't that like a little bit risky? Because obviously with the machine learning, it learns over time, but the first time, couldn't it then skip some unit tests that might be important?
Yeah, I guess there's always an element of risk in however machine learning is actually applied.
Yeah.
So I think, again, we'll produce a report. It didn't show it in the visualization to essentially show you which ones we've chosen, which ones we haven't. So I think it's one of the things where you need to implement some kind of manual review at a particular point. So again, it's a double-edged sword. You can gain massive efficiencies. Same with verifying a deployment if it's healthy or not. But again, you can put in manual checkpoints and reviews within the pipeline.
So could you turn off the machine learning aspect and just run all the unit tests anyway?
Yeah, you can be explicit if you want to use it or not.
Mm-hmm.
But again, we're very good at kind of surfacing what's going on in the pipeline. But if you don't trust it and you don't want to use it, and there's some other benefit in the platform, you could switch that off in the kind of CI module.
I know something we do. We don't actually use this particular feature yet, but something we do is for anything that's a tag, so anything that is essentially then going from actually getting promoted, up to beta or up to production, that has to run all tests. So it might be that you'd use for example, the machine learning stuff for when you're doing PR branches. Yeah. You're doing some QA. You just want that to be QA'd as quickly as possible. If you make a mistake there, it's not ideal, but it's not a big deal. I think you might then, if you have like a tag that's beta or production, you probably do want to run all the tests just in case. But you could easily do that. That's not difficult.
Thank you. I think a few questions. You've mentioned that you're pushing half-baked code as soon as possible to... that's probably a better expression.
Thanks.
Sorry for that. Just to get the feedback as soon as possible. And I guess a few questions here is, could that not be automated? And then the other one, have you considered blue-green deployments, where you would push that code off the branch without it going to master? So you'd get the feedback, and then you just kill it off, and your master is not affected. And the final question being that why what did I even want to say? Let's start with these two questions, then I'll remember the third one. Sorry.
Yeah, no problem. So first one, the reason that we wanted to get stuff to production specifically as fast as possible is because our scenario with having lots of data inputs means that often it's quite difficult for us to rebuild those testing scenarios because we're working with sensors that are essentially, they're not unpredictable, but it's unpredictable how customers may have set them up. So let's say we're working with something where we've got 1,000 different sensors in a building. That might be different from how we've got our particular testing set up. So we want to make sure that we can get stuff tested as quickly as possible with those people. I mean, yeah, we do make sure that obviously it's not half-baked code, you know, it is sort of production ready. It's more about getting that presentation and we've often that final 20% of changes fixed. On your second question about blue-green, that is actually something we're looking at doing now and how we will control database changes, because once you get down to database schema changes, it's just really hard. Like, you know, feature flags are not helping you there too much, in my opinion anyway. You might correct me, but you know, it's going to help you on the front end and with like API changes. But when it comes to your database, it's just difficult. You are going to have to probably look at blue-green or canary and those more complex delivery stages, which Harness can help with. But yeah, like that's, I think more we were looking at how do we get that presentation layer, the thing that customers hit, how do we speed that up so that then when we start to do these other changes further back in the pipeline, we're not going to be releasing half-baked code. That was the focus.
Sorry, that was a bad choice of words on my end.
Okay.
But how do you roll it back now? How do you ensure that it doesn't get left behind on master? And if it's not fully tested, is it technical debt that you then acquire because of that? Or
we haven't found that so far because we've just basically been disciplined. I mean, at the end of the day, you do have to make sure with problems like tech debt, just it is discipline. As you know, we've fortunately got quite a good culture of code review and making sure that we actually do remove stale stuff, because we have experienced the classic problem of some features being left in that no one uses it, but then when you try and remove it, it's like knocking over a piece of wood, you know, at the bottom of a house and the whole house falls down. So, you know, this is actually, we've been more trying to make sure we have this culture of, you know, make sure you remove the old stuff, otherwise you will just leave it in there and you will get that tech debt. But that is something that I think that has to be culture driven as much as anything. You know, tools can help, but you've got to make sure your development culture is right.
Thank you.
No problem.
One additional question regarding the feature flag setup. Does this influence also the setup of the test systems you need and the amount of test systems you need, or is this totally independent?
For us, so far, it's been essentially independent. You know, we've had the same testing setups, the same code processes. Basically, the difference has been that we've been able to get to production faster, and we've found, you know, the edge cases quicker. But in terms of the way we've written tests, the way we've done stuff, it's not really changed anything.
So you have a fixed amount of test systems doing your tests?
Yeah, correct.
From an agile point of view, how are you treating the cleanup? Are you attaching it to the story? Is it a new story? I'm just curious as like how the removal of a feature flag is treated from a process point of view.
It's basically just been a task attached to the story for us, you know, so it's one that at some point we deal with, but the story is kind of, it's delivered once the feature is in production, it's all been tested and accepted by product. It's then up to us again as the development team to make sure that, you know, we're doing our own maintenance, make sure we're doing our own cleanup. But the task is sort of, it's complete, but then there is a separate, like, related task. But the story itself is done. But yeah, again, I think it comes back to you got to make sure you got that culture of, you know, don't leave code you're not using, otherwise it'll come back to bite you. It really will.
Cool. Excellent. I think we're good.
Thanks, everyone.
Thanks very much. Cheers.